welcome Rebecca. Come join us. Yes. For those who don't know Rebecca, just a little background. She has her MFA in creative writing from New York University. We were listening to the whoa. Her first book, which is the book that we discussed at Books and Brews, and I think Matt and I discussed, it was 2016. 2016
in December.
November.
But 2016
Yes.
for Rebecca.
Yeah. Another Place You've Never Been. There's copies over here. And that book was her debut fiction, long listed for the Center for Fiction for a first novel prize. She's also won prizes and Book of the Year mentions on a number of platforms for her books after that. Gunners, House on Fripp Island, and Chorus was her latest book. But she's here tonight to talk to us about the book that just came out in January of this year from Counterpoint Press, I'll Come to You. So let's give another warm welcome, return welcome for Rebecca. Thank you so much for being flexible with our snow schedule and everything else. And like Matt said, this is the kind of book that when people say to me who read nonfiction, they say, why read fiction? This makes me so excited because I'll be like, read this! Because I dropped in on a Sunday afternoon reading it, and I suddenly looked up and I said, I have 10 pages until I'm done. And really, that's an amazing gift. So thank you for the ability to kind of engage and take us to places. And I love what reviews say about this book is that they keep mentioning the word light. And that's something that as you read this book, you discover these moments, and it feels like light is shown on certain things, and they're normal. They're all of us. They're what we're talking about right now. So let's just ask the first question of, how does an author captivate a reader in that way? I mean, really, we all know writers who write really well, and it might be just more about your process because, but how do you engage in that crescendo?
Thank you for the question and the introduction. And just quickly, thank you all so much for being here. My goodness. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Mary Katharine. Thank you, Pale Fire and WMRA. Let's see. How to captivate an audience. I think something that is particularly important to me in this book and has sort of emerged as the idea that unifies all of my work is to notice and honor what is rich and mysterious and beautiful about ordinary lives. And it sort of came together in my own mind when I heard the writer Elizabeth Strout, who I admire very much, say in a recent interview, every person is a world. Yeah. And, so I think my aspiration is always to celebrate that. And I've noticed with time, trial and error, what my limitations are as a writer, and among many, I can't write in first person. I can't ever conceive of a novel as a novel. It always has to start as short story. So I have all sorts of things that I've learned that I can't do. And among them is writing about people who are extraordinary in any external way. People who are super wealthy, super beautiful, super talented, super famous. And my heart is always with the ordinary folks, the folks who we see and interact with every day. And the idea that they are capable of something extraordinary, or that something extraordinary exists within, is what I always aim to capture. And it thrills me, of course, when that resonates with readers. And so that's what I set out to do, is notice that and put it on the page and give it a narrative shape.
Yeah. It's a hard question to say. How do you captivate? How do you make this a book you cannot put down? But I think probably the fact that the reader sees people they recognize themselves, in what you've done. How about just kind of before we get into the content of the book, how was it writing the fifth book? The idea, was there any kind of weight upon you as an author with what you've done with carrying forward things from your readers or your publisher or yourself as to how do you begin that? How do you start?
I would say the weight is a little bit less with everything that I write because, every time I complete a manuscript is further proof that I can do it, and it stands to reason that I could do it again. And so I no longer carry the weight or the anxiety of, can I write a book? And, in fact, for I think almost every book that I've published, there is another one that is in the trash that has occurred in between the sellable manuscripts. So I no longer have trepidation about my ability to do it. However, the actual process is a bit different every time, except the fourth and fifth book were quite similar in the same harrowing sense, which is that I spent several years in both cases on a book that ultimately went nowhere. It ended up in the trash. Years. And then when I finally arrived at the decision to move on to something with my agent, the next book, which includes I'll Come to You and Chorus, my previous book, came out very, very quickly, like 3 or 4 months in both cases. 3 or 4 months for a first draft, 3 or 4 months for editing, and that was it. And so I think in both cases, the takeaway for me is that the subconscious is at work all the time. And so even when the lifeless manuscripts that just never panned out were what I was actually typing every day, my subconscious was very hard at work on this book and the one before. And I think, it's really exciting for me when a student will have a similar experience where they'll be toiling away at a short story for weeks and weeks and weeks, or months and months if I'm lucky as a teacher. And then, I'll get a panicked email 2 or 3 days before it's due, and they'll say, I just realized it doesn't work. It's not right. It's not what I want. And I'm like, perfect. Start something new. And, that's like, it can have a terrible outcome as well. But the best case scenario is that there was something urgent inside of them, pressing up and out, and it just wasn't the story they thought they were writing, and what comes out instead is more true. Yeah.
So not necessarily mechanical, but something that just kind of happens.
Yeah. And in the case of this book, I know I mentioned to Chris as well, I was trying desperately to finish the previous book because I was pregnant with my second child and had a very small child that I was already caring for. So I thought, once I have 2, there's just no way. I was resigned to just not writing for several years. And so I thought I just had to finish that manuscript. And when we decided it wasn't going to happen, put it aside. And then I had my child, and while time was very short, I found 5 minutes here, 25 minutes there, and this was actually written right after he was born. So instead of serving as the barrier to the book, having my child was the catalyst for it. So strange. Unexpected things happen.
Big magic. I think of Elizabeth Gilbert and that whole idea that these ideas are floating and they grab you and you pay attention. I can't leave the idea of having a one coming on and trying to write. And I felt that there was a section here, the main character, and we'll get to just kind of give us an overview of what the book is about, but this scene from a woman that her exhale, she's in her last month, I think, or just before delivery, her exhale sounded thin, barely enough room to pass this small bit of air through her body. And I just thought, what your experiences have to play a part, because that to me, I went, oh yeah. I remember that moment. How much did your experience of having another child bear into this book?
I mean, a great deal in terms of the emotional landscape and the impetus for writing it, the concept itself, which is about, the book is about the reverberations of new life, and certainly that came about from my life. And, I take little bits of this and that from my life all the time, as I think most writers do, but there's rarely a super direct outcome on the page, and never a complete person in a book that is a complete person. I know, good, bad, or ugly. I never try and capture the full person or essence of a full person. But yeah, I'm drawing on my experience, things I see and hear and overhear all the time.
So let's talk a little bit about the book and these cast of characters that you introduce the reader to. Tell us a little bit about, is there a focal character? Is there somebody who really you couldn't let go of? And just a little bit about what the book. We all know it's a family, a young couple who are waiting for a child, and then all of the people connected to them in that, their mother-in-laws and their father-in-laws and all of the different components. So can you tell us a little bit about the characters?
Sure. So just a broad overview of the book. It is a book about family. It takes place over the course of 1 year, and it's told in monthly stories. So January opens with news of the pregnancy, and then it moves through the baby's first holiday, and it alternates perspective. So January opens with Ellen, who becomes the expectant grandmother, and I feel like I have to just sort of tell how Ellen and Gary, her blind date in the opening chapter, came to life, because it is almost all of my characters come about in more or less this fashion. So I was in line at our local Food Lion, Harmony Square, and I just observed an interaction that thrilled me. It was a man and a woman, older, and seemed to be acquainted with one another loosely. Maybe I thought they attended the same church or something. And she asked him with just such hope and goodwill, "How was your summer?" And he was kind of fiddling with stuff, looking at a text, messing with his reading glasses, and he said, "Lousy." And that was it. that was the entire interaction. And so that just stuck with me. And, things like that, I can't let go of them. They just delight me. And so I'm like, lousy, why lousy? And why isn't he being more polite to her? What has truly happened that he can't, muster up even this much social energy? So sort of the dynamic that from which those characters were born, and that really is true to how most things start. And I have the help. I have to thank my sister who's here, who's become very attuned to the sort of little tidbit that's likely to delight me, and so she occasionally helps me collect those. But that's often the starting place is a person that interests me. And from there, I'm going to kind of use an idea that I was lucky to stumble upon very recently, an interview with the writer Lydia Davis, who I admire very much. And she was talking about how material develops. And she said something along the lines of, her quest is to always look to that original material, the original spark, and stay true to it. So I like the idea of that, because, when we're writing, we're constantly saying, is this right? Is this right? What is true? What is true? We're trying to get there. And my experience is always that I have to reach a point where I have landed on what is the most true to me as a writer, and hope that is the case for some readers as well. But I felt like the way that she thinks about it and articulated it takes a little bit of the burden off of me. So instead of always seeking for what do I think is the most right and the most true gesture in any given moment, what is the most true to the original idea, the people that first, and I'm not talking anymore about the real people who inspired it, but the life that it took inside of me, always trying to return to that and say, well, what is that material trying to express, and what is most true to that? Because somehow that feels a little bit bigger and better and more mysterious than, relying on my own sensibilities.
Love that. That is taking lousy to this level of truth, and you do it. I mean, when you say that story, the blind date with Gary, he was not impressive. What you've got, these other characters they're all uncovering pieces, and I think there's a mother-in-law, Janet, who I fell in love with. Not a perfect person, but in some way, are you trying to illuminate and I'm saying this, I know you're going to go, I'm not, but in the journey of a young woman having a child, we get lost in our own experiences. And the idea that there's all these things happening, life is progressing, but we're all rotating around these big changes. It's hard to come outside of that. In some way, it felt very compassionate that you were examining other people's lives in progress. Did you experience that in what you were writing? Was that some piece of what was coming out, or is this one of those themes that you're like, no?
No, I definitely. I always fall in love with a character. It doesn't matter how despicable I may set out for them to be. Once they are alive to me, I love them. And even when they're really annoying, which she is, but she was actually really enjoyable to write because I found her very humorous in all of her idiosyncrasies and sort of, more despicable moments. But I love them once they are on the page and once I've decided to give them life. I really like what you said about, there's the birth of the new child, and yet in this stage of life more than maybe ever before, Janet has such difficulty connecting with her children and then eventually the grandchild. There's just something from her own past that is so painful that it gets in the way, and it's unspoken, and it's arguably unknown and unknowable. And that's something that always interests me as well, is, what is unknowable in the people around us and within. And something that I have sort of tried to think about in my ongoing interest in the unknowable and the unknown, I've started to try and think about overtones when I craft a story, which bear with me through maybe a sort of annoying metaphor, but an overtone in music is so you think of the harmonic structure. There's the fundamental tone, and then there are other tones that appear above it, and they are softer, but they contribute to what the listener hears. They're all part of it. So when I'm crafting a story, I'm trying to think about the fundamental note, and then what else exists that's maybe softer and stranger and maybe even a little bit mysterious or mystical, that's far above that, and how they commingle to and work together to create the final story. Janet's a great example. To use another example, there's a story where Rob, who is a brother of the expectant mother, is at his children's school for their career day, and he has volunteered to present in the hopes of really impressing his sons. He's a recent divorcee, and he's desperate to sort of win back their approval. And he has not prepared for this at all. He's a car salesman and sort of had the idea that showing up in a cool outfit and just being a cool guy is going to be enough to win over the class. And he suddenly finds himself in front of a room full of people, 30 minutes and nothing to say, nothing. And so... And so, that's the fundamental note. That's where the reader spends most of their time on the page. And then above that is, the pain of the recent divorce. And that factors in. And above that is the reason that for the divorce, which is his compulsive lying. And above that is the reason for the compulsive lying, which is sort of has its foundation in a traumatic event that occurred in his own childhood. And then above that, very faint, but always there, is a deep, painful crisis of identity, which exists within Rob all the time. So all of these factors combine and interact to create the final story, even though what you're reading about for 90% of the story is this middle-aged man sweating and fumbling in front of a classroom. So yeah.
That's the part that those layers. I definitely think, and I don't think we give anything away in anything we share tonight, because the words have their own beauty as you read this, and that's what I had to go back to and reread sections, and I've marked 1 million. So we're hoping to hear her read some of this tonight too, so you get a feel for that. And you could even end that Rob story with what he did.
What did he do? I can't remember. Okay. So Rob ends up realizing he has a wallet full of cash from a bachelor party the previous weekend, and he decides to start handing out cash to the students, and thinking that since he has nothing to say, he's like, maybe I can give you some money, you can put it towards your first vehicle in 10 years. And so he has them choose like a lottery, which bill they pick. So that's his sort of flailing attempt to,
And the teacher is going, what am I supposed to do?
The teacher doesn't know
this?
if what he's doing is even legal.
Just gave cash to kids. I don't know what. It's a great, and I think a good piece towards looking at some of those other pieces you put into this, which is humor. And what a gift right now to have that ability to see all of that and then have that lightness in the pain. You mentioned sort of your husband is inspirer for some of the humor. Is that right?
I did. Yeah, I mentioned to Chris. Yeah, while I don't take any people from my life and use them wholesale, my husband does have the disadvantage of being extremely funny. So now and then he comes up with a line that I just have to kind of collect. And
is there one in here that you used?
Oh, none come to mind. None come to mind.
To claim there's a scene that I have to say is one that I just went, it's painful but also really humorous, with Janet and her husband, who is suffering from dementia, which she is covering a little bit, and she wants a photo. Can you share with us that scene, just a little bit of that with the hair dye that she decides to do?
So Janet is hosting her daughter's baby shower, and she is really desperate for some family photos because of her husband's cognitive decline. She's become increasingly desperate about just having nice, solid photographic evidence. They're still in their prime. They're still doing it, still looking, feeling great. And she noticed in the more recent family photos they took that his hair didn't look right. It was aging him. So she decides she wants to spruce him up with some just for men hair dye, and it goes, horribly, horribly wrong. Ends in blood and sweat. I can't remember for sure about tears, probably.
Pretty rough, but very fun and also sad at the same time. So it's that combination. You also take us back. It's 1995 in the book. Why did you go back 30 years to that time period? Was it specific to the setting for your characters?
I don't remember consciously making that decision, but in thinking back now and in thinking about the way that I think about my current work and what will be next, I really dislike technology. I really, really dislike it. And I don't like having to deal with it in my work. I don't like having to deal with cell phones. I don't like them to serve a role in the stories that I tell. And I think part of that is because I tend to write really dialogue heavy work, and in the absence of when you didn't have the option to text instead of having a conversation over the phone at the very least, a lot more of these difficult conversations happened face to face. At least that's how I think about it. And so to me, it's purely a narrative. It's a narrative choice. I feel like I can tell stories in the most rich way when it's person to person, face to face. Having conversations, in the flesh, the way it used to be done.
So in other words, you threw out the cell phone, and you knew that was prior to 2000. I love that. That's great. The title, I'll Come to You, I thought really, I always look for when the title comes up, and it felt, I rediscovered though, I found it at 2:06, which was just about 2 pages before the ending. But I found it earlier, just recently when I was going back through my quotes. Is that one of those overarching themes? Where did the title come from? What does that mean?
Yeah, thank you. So I am notoriously bad at titling my own work. This is, I think, one of only 2 titles. Yeah, Chorus is the other one that I titled, and we ended it with that one. But everything else, the publisher has been very unhappy with the titles that I suggested. And so then we've conferred and come up with other options. But this one pleased me so much. So, this was not the first title I suggested. So they were iffy on the first title I suggested. But we had a lot of time. The book sold about 2 years before publication. So they said, let's just sit on it as we go through edits and stuff. And this title came to me in the night as I went to console my child, and I just thought, that's gotta be it. That's gotta be it. And in the middle of the night, it felt right, but I didn't know if these words appeared in the book. So I had to wait till the next morning, and then I searched through the manuscript, and there they were, 2 occasions spoken by character, who it makes perfect sense that she's the one to voice that phrase, and it sure felt right to me. And I emailed the publishing team and my agent, and they all agreed that was the one.
Yeah. It's a great. It sums up so much. I thought of. Because it corresponds to so many of your characters in what they're doing and how they're connecting. Mm-hmm. So this is a Books and Brews. This is a conversation with you all. And we have so many reviewers and readers and other folks in the audience. I definitely want to turn it over. And I would love to make sure we have a little time for you to read a little bit too. So we'll turn it over. And if there's any pressing questions of folks wondering, since we haven't gotten to the heart, what is this about? The question is process. Do you write it straight through and it stays that way, or do things get moved around and shift through in the process?
Thank you for that question. Good friend, amazing writer, Sophia Samatar. So the last two books I've written, there has not been much in the way of shifting around. They've more or less emerged in their final form, and then there's a lot of work in terms of line editing. I usually find that the more structural change is required, the worse it's going to get. But that has really changed because my first two books, I did a lot of backtracking and, just sort of toggling scenes and Post-it notes, organizing characters and deciding what belonged where. And at the time I enjoyed that work. I think because I was in both cases just so surprised to have a book and so pleased to have anything to do with it. And it's really changed for me. For me, all of the excitement now is in the adrenaline of the first draft. And so I can kind of just try and ride that wave. A lot of refinement of language, but beginning to end, they tend to resemble the first draft usually by the time I get to the end. Yeah. Thank you.
That's a great question. That the story of Rob and the layers, does that happen in one session, or do those layers build?
It can happen in one session. I can find and reach a character very quickly. Sometimes. Janet is an example. She's the first character I think ever in my life that I have met, and I knew A to Z about her immediately. Most characters it takes longer, and it's a process of, again, trial and error, like putting on the page what the hair color is, what the favorite TV show is, what the favorite drink is, and it's just like, again, to return to something I said earlier, it's just a question of, is this true? Is this true? Is this true? And it's so hard to say what that truth is. And really the best case scenario is that character leads me, and that's one of those things that writers say that sounds really false, but that is the best case scenario, is that the character teaches me who they are, and I try to listen. I try to be, sort of as empty as possible, be a vessel, and know them and love them, and not define them, not become too controlling in terms of what I want to do with them, but let them sort of run around and make their own way. But that can take, every now and then, I would say over the course of writing a book, maybe 5 or 10 times I'll have an experience where it comes really quickly, and it'll be many words, and most of them are decent within a couple hours. But then there's a lot of days where it's just, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, does this work? A lot of fussing around that is awkward and a little bit excruciating, but the easy moments happen often enough that it sustains the writer.
Yeah.
Did you know that was coming?
When did you come to the Rob trauma, or did you know it was coming?
So, thank you. I love that question. So the event is alluded to in an earlier chapter narrated by Rob's father. So I knew that the event existed, that this event existed, but I didn't fully understand its impact on Rob, or how he factored into it at all until much later in the book. So the event existed, but then I had to kind of listen to, I had to listen to the murmurings of what my characters wanted to express to realize, the breadth of its impact on him. Yeah. So it was always part of the family story, but the particulars of his involvement didn't come till quite a bit later. Yeah.
Do you sometimes get ahead of yourself and imagine them too early, or do you let the process and the things unfold?
Thank you. That's a great question. I usually need to have a little bit of direction to have a fruitful writing session. I need to have a little bit of a destination, but it doesn't need to be related to plot. It can just be like a line that I think that exactly. It can be any small little thing, but I usually do need to have some destination, something that I want to work into the day's work. But the best case scenario is that something unexpected happens, and it's very rare that I figure something out fully too soon to translate it truthfully onto the page. And I think part of that is just I've had enough experience with trying to do that, trying to overdetermine a story, that I don't even go there anymore. If I know too much, if I know like fundamentally, thematically what a story is about, it's dead. I need to ride like the intuition of the first draft before I know anything big.
How does it evolve? Do you have an outline? Do you know if it's beginning and the end, or some ideas of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't work with outlines, but I do tend to work well with an overarching structure. So in the case of this book, I had determined that it was going to take place over the course of the year and be told in monthly stories. So that much I had figured out, and that's enough to like really get things going. I've learned that I do really well with some sort of container. So I like to figure out some sort of shape, structure, but it can have very little to do with plot. It usually has nothing to do with plot, and nor character development. That's all in the writing of it. But yeah, I'm the sort of student who, if they said, write a short story about anything at all, anything under the sun, I'll twiddle my thumbs for 10 years. But if they say, write a short story that takes place over the course of the month of January, then I can come up with 10 ideas in 10 seconds. So I like to have a few boundaries. Yeah.
Why were some months multiple? Was there too much chatter from your characters? Part 1, part 2.
Oh my! To give you a really crude answer, the book wasn't long enough. So my editor said, I love my editor so much. He said that we need to live in this world longer. There just needs to be more. And he said, but I don't want to violate the structure of this book, the monthly stories. So what can we do? Are we going to add some separate chapters titled for holidays, or like, is there a spring break chapter? And I mulled it over for a while, and then I decided to do extra chapters for the summer months, because to me that's how I experience time, is that it slows down in the summer, and it felt appropriate to do extra vignettes over the summer and then a few over December too, which makes sense, I thought, with the pace of life in the holidays.
It felt right. I could say, and then it was beautiful because they were different rhythms as you would switch. But listening to you talk about character development makes me think they were chattering a lot during those times. I know, comparing it to when I recommend or talk about it with folks, I compare it a lot to Elizabeth Strout and Olive Kitteridge. Was there a particular character that you had a hard time leaving, as you would go on to another chapter, or anyone that you felt really was a focal place? No, I never have a hard time leaving my books.
It feels like the most natural thing in the world to me when I reach the end of a narrative and then, do a couple months of editing, sometimes happily, sometimes a little bit grudgingly. But again, to me, the joy is in the first draft. The joy is in discovery, and everything after that becomes a little bit less and a little bit less and a little bit less. And so, I love them. The characters that I wrote, I have deep fondness for them, but I have no desire to return to them. Although, thank God, Elizabeth Strout did her second, Olive Again, the second book with the same set of characters, is every bit as beautiful and, incredible as the first book. But yeah, that's not my experience. I finish an arc and then I wish them well and I'm on to the next. Yeah, I had such a strange experience recently. I sort of skimmed through my second book because I found out that my 15-year-old nephew was going to read it, which was equally terrorizing and touching to me. And so I was like, oh, what is this book? And so I, just kind of like skimmed through it. I didn't even have a physical copy. I was just like looking through a PDF on my phone. And the biggest surprise was how much of it I didn't remember. Just huge swaths of that book. No memory. And, and what really blew my mind was, so the main character in this book, the expectant mother, is named Corinne. And when I landed on that name, I just liked it. I liked the look of it. I liked the sound of it and the feel of it. Just thought it was right. And I was stunned when I looked in The Gunners, my second book, and realized there's a main character named Corinne. And I had that, ostensibly, however many years ago, had the exact same experience of like, I have no idea why, but yeah, I don't know a Corinne, but I like that name. It just works. It's right. And so I shudder to think how often this might happen, given how much distance I for whatever reason, create with previous books.
And they're not related. This is not the same Corinne from The Gunners. Good to know. Yeah.
I don't.
Do you ever record in your recorder with your stream of thought?
No, I don't. And I don't even take notes very often. The good ideas stick with me enough that I've learned to just rely on my memory. What's that? Oh, what's that?
I can see her in the grocery store saying lousy. Into recorder. All right, so yes. So the question is about the line edits and what kind of tightening is that? What kind of, is it streamlining? Is it language? What are you doing in those?
Yeah, thank you, Jess. That's a great question. For my own purposes, it's usually to clarify things. I have a lot less, I don't know quite how to put this. I have less, this is going to sound absurd as a writer. I have less patience and interest in language than ever before. I just like story is what drives me now, whereas in my earlier work, I really care deeply about language and word choice and the rhythm and the beauty of it. And I feel like at this, maybe it's a stage of life thing, but I just want to tell the story and I want to tell it so clearly. It's very important to me that I'm economical and that what I want to express is conveyed absolutely as clearly as possible. So when I'm doing line edits of my own, it's to get rid of anything that gets in the way of clarity. And then my other readers, my sister and other readers will look for things like repeated words. I tend to have little hiccups, words that I repeat, for, out of anxiety or, overly qualifying things. So, I will rely on readers and copy editors to help with that. But for my own line edits, I want it to be clear. Thank you.
Dialogue is so good. And I think you answered that first question about why we are so cannot put it down, because it's real. I do want to give a little time here for her to read a little bit. So I'm not sure, that sound good to everybody? Yeah.
Yeah.
And choose whatever section you would like.
Okay, so this is chapter 1, January of 1995. Ellen's friend Susan mentioned over lunch that her cousin Gary, a retired bank teller, had announced at their family Christmas that he was ready to date again. Susan added, "And I told him that I have a friend who's in the same boat." "I hope you were not referring to me," Ellen said. By the end of the meal, though, Susan had talked her into meeting Gary with the assurance that it would be casual. And despite Ellen's initial reluctance, she felt crests of optimism as she lint-rolled dog fur from her red turtleneck to prepare for the date. On the phone, Gary had suggested an early dinner at Dratman's, a family-owned sit-down place that served everything, he said, from a hot dog to a king crab. A bitter wind made its way up Ellen's nostrils, and snow creaked beneath her heels on the short walk across the parking lot. Gary was waiting near the host stand. Ellen spotted him before he saw her. He had fuzzy gray hair and was slumped on a bench. He straightened up immediately, but only partially when she entered. He said, "Ellen, I thought you'd be coming from the other way. Susan said you live on Cedar." Ellen said, "I do. I'm coming from the Salvation Army." "Do you volunteer?" "Nope, just some junk to drop." "Brr." Gary gestured outside, then inside. "Shall we?" They were seated at a nice table next to a window. Their server was a man with a strategically placed Band-Aid covering most of a tattoo on his neck. Gary opened his menu and put on reading glasses. Ellen ordered chicken with rice pilaf, and Gary ordered the Salisbury steak. "I always wondered what that was," Ellen said. "Salisbury." Gary said, "I believe it's a region." The server returned with a basket of bread, and Gary ordered a bottle of the house red. Ellen rarely drank alcohol, but didn't want Gary to think he'd made a mistake, so she accepted a glass when one was offered. Ellen said, "How were your holidays?" "Lousy." Gary took off his reading glasses and slipped them into the pocket of his jacket. "Yours?" "My son and his wife were with her folks on Christmas Eve, then me on Christmas Day. It was marvelous. We have our little traditions." Gary took a roll from the basket and tore it in half. Steam billowed from it. "Grandkids?" Ellen shook her head. "Any day, though. They're eager. Trying. And you're eager, too," Gary observed. "I love children," said Ellen. And because it was so true, she said it again. "I love children." "I guess so. Susan said you're a school bus driver." Ellen nodded. 35 years. It's something to see them grow. Amazing things happen. I'll look at the girl ringing up my groceries or cleaning my teeth and realize I drove her to school when she was 5. I'll remember where she lived. I'll remember her name. And do they remember yours? I usually have to remind them. Ellen gazed around the dining room. There was only one other couple seated, and they were even older than her and Gary. Slow, jazzy piano music was playing. There was a green decorative lantern glowing on each table, giving the place an otherworldly feel. "Do you have children?" "A daughter," Gary said. "She lives in Florida. We don't talk much. She dates women. She thinks I don't know, but her mother tells me." He took a hefty sip of wine and then another. "I really don't care who she dates. My daughter, I mean. But my ex, too, for that matter. As it happens, though, my ex is dating an excavator, which I find funny. But enough about me. How do you know Susan?" "Well, our sons were good friends in high school, and she and I kept up even after the boys were long gone. Her Kenny's apparently become quite the trombonist. He's part of a traveling band based out of Milwaukee, and they perform everywhere from Boston to Buffalo. Well, what am I saying? You know this already. You've just spent Christmas with their family." Gary said, "I didn't know that, actually. Kenny wasn't there, and I've learned to tune out Susan's yapping." Gary polished off his glass of wine and poured himself another. Ellen felt hope dribbling out of her. She peered outside. The sky was the color of wet concrete. Some teenagers were horsing around in the parking lot of the strip mall across the way, drawing pictures in the frosted-over windows of the dry cleaners. Gary said, "Susan must have something against you, setting you up on a date with me. That's a joke. You can laugh. But seriously, look at you." Gary flung his hand dramatically in Ellen's direction. "And then look at me." Ellen had no idea what to do. Gary just shrugged. Sorry. Ellen excused herself to the restroom where she did a positive affirmation into the mirror and straightened her collar. For Christmas, her son Paul had given her a gift certificate to JCPenney, and several days ago she had considered spending that gift certificate on a nice fragrance or a new garment for this date. What a freaking joke. Thank goodness she hadn't worked up the motivation to actually get out and do that. Their meal had arrived by the time Ellen was back. Gary poked at his meat with the tip of his knife. Not what I expected, he said. He looked up at her bleary-eyed like he was submerged in water, then back down at his plate. Ellen said, "That doesn't look like a steak, does it? It looks more like a burger just covered with sauce instead of put in a bun." Gary laughed, and to Ellen's surprise, it sounded like a nice person's laugh, hearty and warm. Gary said, "Tell me about your son." "Well, Paul and Corinne live in Lamb, 2 hours away. You're probably familiar. And like I said, hopefully a little one soon. I really think this is the year." "You seem confident." "Well, it's what the lady on the psychic hotline told me." Gary laughed again. He took a bite. "So what do Paul and Corinne do?" "You've heard of Webb's Jam? That's where they both work and where they met. She does office work, handling bulk orders, and he started on the manufacturing line but has risen through the ranks and runs the whole packaging wing now." "How's that pilaf?" "It's remarkable." "Good. You know, there was a telemarketer that called up the other day," Gary said. "Her name was Pilar, not Pilaf, but your dish there reminded me." This Pilar was trying to sell me on some magazine subscriptions. Nice accent. And I got her to tell me a little bit about herself, and I told her some things about me. She kept trying to steer it back to the sale, of course, so I went along with that, eventually got out my credit card. I really had her going. She thought she was going to make the sale of the century. The time came to read her my card, and just before I was through the whole thing, I hung up. I don't know why I'm telling you this. What the hell? Well, anyway, a full hour she kept calling, thinking we'd been disconnected. I probably ruined her whole day. Poor Pilar. How pathetic is that? How mean am I? Good grief. That is mean. You've got it now, Ellen. The server returned to check on their meals, and to Ellen's great relief, Gary did not order more alcohol.
I think that may be the place.
Yes. That's beautiful, really. I mean, that gives you a taste, and I hope that if y'all don't have a copy, you go get a copy. They're over here. She'll be here to sign. If you have one, get one for a friend. It's the time of year we need to be reading this kind of thing and find the light in the everyday. Lots of things. Let's give Rebecca a thank you.